So, welcome everyone. I guess we'll wait a few minutes for people to arrive before we would have a head start. But to those arriving now, welcome to this session on Central Eastern European housing policies. And yeah, I just wait a few seconds here before I give some context on this session to see if anyone's arriving. I also think there's no break from the previous panel, so maybe people need to grab some coffee. Hi to those arriving. I was just saying we'll wait a minute for people to get here before we start. This is the pose that people now got used to, I guess, on online meetings, and I just tend to fill the silence. So maybe I quickly introduce myself to those people that are arriving to this session. My name is Lili Wanko, and I'm an advocacy officer at Habitat for Humanity Hungary. And I'll be moderating this session on Central and Eastern European housing policies. And I see people are entering this session. So probably we'll have a head start, and whoever comes a tiny bit late, I'm sure you've all read the description before joining this event. So yeah, I hope you've had an enjoyable time at the Europe Housing Forum so far. And thank you for joining us, because I saw that there's quite a few parallel sessions running that are all very interesting. So thank you for picking this one on Central Eastern Europe. And maybe I give you a bit of a context as to how this session was put together and why we thought this would be an important topic to cover. I think broadly speaking there, we can say that there's a bit of an agreement that often Central Eastern European housing issues are maybe not so high on the agenda or an EU agenda, and often when solutions are put forward, they make assumptions that maybe don't apply in many Central and Eastern European countries. For instance, a notable example would be solutions that necessitate a high social or municipal housing stock, which is usually not the case. Usually most Central Eastern European countries don't have a fair or a higher share of publicly owned housing, and a lot of solutions would necessitate that. For instance, in terms of battling homelessness, or in terms of guaranteeing affordable housing, or even in terms of energy efficiency renovations, when it's privately owned, the whole process becomes all the more complicated. So we thought that we kind of want to fill this gap, and often it happens that you're at an event and maybe you're already only face representing a Central Eastern European country, and sort of in a bid to change that, we thought of organizing this session. But on the other hand, another thing that I personally take issue with is that oftentimes geographical regions are treated as a homogeneous region, and where even if it's the case that many Central and Eastern European countries have a shared or similar historical heritage, in the past 30 years, they've also developed in many different ways. So it's not like you can think of a one-size-fits solution, and I think we can learn a lot from each other. So it's this double goal of, first of all, raising Central and Eastern European issues onto the agenda, and then discussing what are the similarities and what are the differences and where we could be to each other's advantage. So that was sort of the apropos of this session, and we thought who else could represent Central and Eastern European countries best than Habitat for Humanity national directors from the region. So I will introduce them one by one. I think we're quite short on time, so I won't go through a list of introductions now. Just in terms of the agenda, we'll have 4 5-minute interventions from each national director who I will introduce in turn. And then we have, after this sort of 25-minute session, 10 minutes for discussion. It will be a panel discussion between the attendees, and then you'll have 5 minutes to ask questions. And I think you must be used to it by now that it's only possible via the chat. So I will keep an eye on the chat as well for that Q&A session. So without further ado, I will pass the word on to our first speaker, who is Mincho Benov, the National Director of Habitat for Humanity Bulgaria. And I will keep track of the time, and over to you, Mincho. Is it possible that we lost Mincho? Because I don't see him on the screen. Okay, then hopefully he'll come back. And in a quick turn of events, then I hand the word over to George Sekbavi, who's my colleague at Habitat. Oh, Mincho's back. Okay, then let's take the original order. Are you? No worries. I mean, I think we're all used to in these digital times that. Mincho, are you prepared to give your intervention now?
Yes, sure.
Okay, perfect. So then,
Thank you, Lily.
sorry for the confusion. Mincho, over to you.
Thank you. Let me start by providing some bits of the local context. The predominant share of the housing stock in Bulgaria is privately held. At present, over 96% of the housing stock is privately held, and this is not a result of a privatization during the last 2 or 3 decades. It's always been the case. I guess this is the reason, this is what shaped the position of the national level policymakers back in the 90s, that we don't have housing issues in the country whatsoever. The predominant share of the housing stock is private and everyone has a home. And I'm afraid the housing policies in Bulgaria have been neglected ever since. At a glance, it seems to be true. The availability of 3.9 million housing units for 3 million households.
Okay, I believe Mincho is experiencing some technical difficulties. I will wait 20 minutes to see if he can reconnect, seeing as he already started his presentation. So let's not jump to another country just yet. And if that, okay, Mincho's back
Um,
with us. No worries. I mean,
I don't know what's going on, probably the connection or something. Uh, uh, anyway, at first glance, it seems that we don't have any issues. There are 3.9 million housing units for 3 million households, which suggests excess of housing. But the picture gets completely different when we take into account the 30% share of uninhabited housing stock in the country, which leads to shortage and overcrowdedness rate of 41%. And 41% is the average overcrowdedness rate. In the cities, it's 48%, which is every second home, actually. Other pressing issues of the housing system relate to the poor condition of the residential buildings. 3/4 of the apartments are in buildings older than 30 years and buildings which have been poorly maintained. Many people from ethnic minorities, primarily Roma, live in informal settlements in substandard housing conditions, often with no access to basic infrastructure and services. We do struggle with the phenomenon of the poor homeowners who cannot afford to maintain their properties. And besides, Bulgaria falls into the category of extreme energy poverty, according to the European Domestic Energy Poverty Index. With all these problems at hand, obviously we need to have a sound institutional capacity, systems and instruments in place which would allow tackling all these issues. Unfortunately, this is not the case. In my opinion, the institutional capacity is underdeveloped. The development, implementation of housing policies, programs, interventions, strategies, etc., is in the domain of a department with the local Ministry of Regional Development and Public Works. And this housing policies department has failed to deliver and take proper action. An example for that is the current housing strategy which we have, and yes, we do have housing strategy, which is of 2004. Obviously irrelevant to the current problems and issues we have to tackle. As for the local governments, their responsibilities are limited to the management of the municipal housing stock, which is symbolic. It's 2.4% of the total housing stock, insufficient to meet the demand for subsidized housing. Thank you.
thank you very much. Even with the internet difficulties, you were bang on time. So congratulations. We're off to a good start. Thank you, Mincho, for your intervention. And now I pass the word on to my colleague, Zsolt Szekfalvi, who's the director of Habitat for Humanity Hungary. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. And I think we have so many similarities with Bulgaria and even with Romania. But now I don't want to go into certain issues in this starting speech. But I'd like to give you a glimpse of 30 years of housing policy in Hungary from the system change in the 90s until today, because I think this could serve or frame well or conversation, because according to our findings, which is in our annual housing report, no government has been able to deal with housing or intervene effectively and strategically to reduce social disparities in the past 30 years. And not least because housing as such has not been in focus for all these years. Just an example, the highest level of government representation was for housing was in the beginning of the 2000s. It was a housing commissioner who dealt with housing in a more or less comprehensive manner, but without too much power. There was never a Secretary of State for housing. And currently, there is a Deputy Secretary of State for Housing, who is attached to the Deputy Secretary of State for Financial Policy. And only one of the tasks is housing from the 14 different tasks he has and focuses. And as we see, the highest representation of housing is in the Ministry of Finance, which means the financial logic of the housing of the current government is really decisive. And in our annual report, we have three main findings about the 3-decade period since the regime change. And I think we can discuss about the current government, but over 3 decades, there were really different colored governments in Hungary. So since the 90s, housing policy has lost much of its public and also political weight, and really has become a fragmented area of intervention. Inequalities in housing have increased. Currently, around 3 million people, 1/3 of the country, suffering at least one of the aspects of the housing poverty. And we think that housing crisis has deepened since the change of regime. And we think the main reason for the deepening of the housing crisis are the over-subsidization of access to private property. And also the severe underfunding of public and non-profit housing, and the targeting of the housing policies, which are mainly to the more affluent. So what we can do about this? Unfortunately, in Hungary, the decision-making process of our current government is non-transparent and really hard to influence from our level. And sometimes our success is not a new initiative, but to working hard to prevent the country and the people from some disastrous decision. And therefore, our strategy is put the government into a sandwich. We are targeting lower than the government, and we are active on the municipality and local level. We are supporting the local decision makers to sophisticate their housing policies, their social support system, and even housing or energy poverty strategies. And we are also working directly with families on this level, which also represents a huge local knowledge from the field, which can be channeled to our advocacy work. And we are also working on the EU level, and we are trying to influence EU policies to help direct funds for important housing issues and indirectly influence the landscape on the country level. I can highlight the renovation wave and also other big EU policies. So that's about the situation in Hungary. and then in the next part of the discussion, we can touch particular issues as well. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Zsolt. I think in the case of Hungary, it's always difficult to avoid the political issues and these political implementations of the government in action. So maybe that was a good introduction to begin with. And we have to move on to our next speaker, who's Magdalena Ruskowska-Cieslak, representing Habitat for Humanity, Poland. Over to you, Magda.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. As for Poland, who is the biggest country in the Central and Eastern European region, it is also one with the smallest housing stock. Out of 14.5 million housing units, only 7% is social housing, so is governed by the municipalities. And for the last 3 decades, the ownership really prevails in Poland. This is due to historical reason, also to the fact that this is viewed by Poles as the only way to really get secure roof over their heads. And the most important, the most burning problem in Poland is the very bad condition of the housing stock and insufficient provision of affordable housing. The estimates say that we miss between 1 and 2 million affordable flats. The physical existence of the flats is not an issue anymore, but affordability exists, and it is growing. Seeing, for example, the 150,000 households queuing for the social housing. So we've proved lower income and some other difficulties, challenges that make them to apply for social housing, generally in bad condition as well, offered in bad conditions. So all that also puts Poland in the bottom of the housing statistics. Overcrowding at the level of 40% in average, bigger cities, and less acute in rural areas. But also all that it is to I need to highlight that 5 years ago our government, for the first time since 3 decades, launched a national housing program with several packages of housing laws. One of them aimed at helping municipalities to regain the control over the housing stock. The very strong tenants' rights make the tenancy even inheritable. I mean, it was until very recently, until 2018, where for the first time municipalities got right to check the income level status after several years of rent. And this is something that impacts very heavily also the reluctance of some municipalities, not all, but some municipalities, to build new housing stock, because if you build and invest in growing the municipal public housing, and you cannot really manage or control the usage of it, then very, very often this is discouraging for the local governments. So as for the main profile, we do have couple of programs. We don't have housing strategy at systemic level, but we do have a couple of programs that support municipalities and homeowner associations for renovation programs. I mean, it is worth to highlight here the thermomodernization program with some subsidies offered for homeowner associations and cooperatives, and other programs that heavily promote ownership in the middle class groups over the unsuccessful Home Plus program that aimed to encourage municipalities, but also private developers to build more of public affordable homes. Unfortunately, this program was really unsuccessful. Yesterday, debate about how to make the private companies to invest more in cooperation with municipalities clearly showed that we miss some incentives for the private companies to launch themselves into public construction. So all in all, the situation is getting better for the number of housing units, but unfortunately it is worsening in terms of affordability, overcrowding, and it is, as according to our research and public opinion polls that we are carrying every second year, it remains, unfortunately, the third biggest problem of Polish households, Polish families, just after the low salaries and inefficient healthcare services. So unfortunately, without a systemic approach, without global country level housing policy, we will still remain in this very low pace of getting better.
Thank you very much, Magda. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intervene in the last 30 seconds. I thought I'd let you finish. It was very interesting to hear about these programs, and we can talk a lot more about why were they not feasible, what directions we should be going into with such programs. But we have to move on to our next speaker, who is Zoran Kostov, who's the National Director of Habitat for Humanity Macedonia. So I pass the word on to you, Zoran, and I also let you know when you have 1 minute left by a show of hands.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you and hello to everyone. I'm Zoran Kostov. I'm National Director of Habitat for Humanity in Macedonia. And what I am going to say is to a certain extent similar to what my colleagues already said, and there are a couple of differences. So let me start with the differences, something that I repeat regularly when we meet together. Macedonia is one of the only one out of these 5 countries that is not a European Union member. So it should be taken into consideration in regard to pretty much everything, including housing sector. Being away from the European integration processes for so long, that made us one of the poorest, if not the poorest country in Europe. That is also something that should be taken into consideration. Under the circumstances, we have huge immigration abroad. We lost 20% of the population in the past 20 years. And this is affecting, to a certain extent, the ratio of housing stock against the household, because people are leaving the country, so the housing stock is still there, abundant. On the other side, what is similar is that high percentage of the housing stock is privately owned, similarly to Bulgaria. 96% of the housing stock is privately owned. And again, something that is important in my understanding is that big percent, about 55% of the housing stock belongs to actually is a housing stock in multifamily apartment buildings that were built during the intensive period of building new socialist kind of apartment blocks back in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. So So that's about the general picture of what we have in Macedonia. And then in terms of organization of the government, similarly to what was already told by my colleagues, we don't have anybody responsible for housing on the highest level in the government. On the central government level, the housing department is part of the Ministry of Transport and Communication. So you can imagine that it gets a very low level of attention by the minister, given the transport and communication are much more important in this moment, and big investments are put into these sectors. Elements of housing, particularly social housing, are part of the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, but given the law that this small percentage socially owned housing, it is more or less irrelevant, say. And part of it is within the Ministry of Economy, particularly residential energy efficiency, that Habitat Macedonia considers to be one of the most important issues, say, in the country. On top of this, we have actually, it is not on top of this, but beside this, we have this regulatory commission for housing, but that is very low profile regulatory body. And in terms of local government, very limited responsibilities on the local government level. They do not have pretty much responsibilities in this regard. So it is, they are considered partners, consider them partners in many of our programs and projects, but it is based not on some systemic effort, but goodwill of the local mayors that puts enthusiasm into housing. So that's in a nutshell what is characteristic for Macedonia. I see on this watch here that these 4 minutes are over, so back to you, Lily.
Very much for respecting our very strict time limits, and thank you very much for your intervention. And that leads us to our last panelist left before we move on to the discussion part, who is Roberto Patrescoiu from Habitat for Humanity Romania. And also I will keep an eye on the time, Roberto, and then over to you for your intervention. Let's see if you can highlight any more differences or similarities.
Yeah, thank you, Lily. When you're the last, it's hard to highlight some differences. Many of the things have been said already. But I'll start with the short story, which I think it's anecdotal for the state of the public housing in Romania. So a few years back on a Habitat for Humanity Romania worksite, we just completed building 36 homes in 5 days on a very large volunteering event. And usually on the day 5 of the event, we hand over the keys to the families. After receiving the key, one of the beneficiaries came and told me, literally astonished, that the very same day he received an official letter from the local municipality, the letter telling him that he has been selected to receive a social house. He was super puzzled, very puzzled, because he did not remember even to submit a request for a social home. But after thinking twice, he indeed remembered that he and his family, some point, they submitted a request for a social home. And that was 13 years back. So not just being an isolated case, this tells a lot. Romania is the country with the least municipal housing, social housing stock in Europe. It's actually less than 1.3% from the total housing stock. And besides the fact that is too low, I mean, definitely too low, it does not function either. So in most cases, you have to wait for years or even decades, as in the story, or basically you just give up, as most of the vulnerable family do. But we were also leading the way in some other stark statistics. I'm sorry for my fellow colleagues from Poland and Bulgaria in terms of, we're the most overcrowded nation in EU, more than 50%. We also have the highest severe deprivation rate of the housing stock, which is more than 15%. And unfortunately, it does not appear that the government, speaking about the role of the government, has a clear strategy to cope with this reality. So what is the role of the central government? Theoretically, it should be three things: to frame a strategy, a housing strategy, to regulate the second, and the third, to finance public housing. Now, this is in theory, because in practice, Romania is basically one of the very few countries in Europe, if not the only one, I think, who does not have a housing strategy and never had a housing strategy. It was just in the year 2016 when a first draft of a housing strategy was put forward with the support from the World Bank. Habitat for Humanity Romania was there in the consultations. And I think it was a very robust document, fairly robust strategy put forward. But to this date, because many government changed, to this date, that strategy never got approved, never saw the light. So it remained, as we say, a drawer strategy, as we say. So this, in a way, this also tells on how important housing is on the public agenda in Romania. It's, if you want a comparison, it's like a Cinderella of the public policies, left behind, always left behind, and hoping that someday a Prince government will indeed come and unveil the crucial role of the sector. Now, getting back to that strategy, which I still think is relevant, there are 5 directions for the housing state in Romania, which are quintessential. First one is the law reform. It's a very complicated institutional architecture. There is a huge law reform that needs to take place in order to speak about public housing in Romania. The second is the shelter security, and that has a lot with the seismic risk in Romania. Third is energy efficiency. Fourth is the better housing for vulnerable families. And here there are 2 main aspects: slums, informal settlements, and the social housing. This is the direction with vulnerable families. And the 5th is the incentivize the affordable housing sector. Speaking about the local authorities, this is another critical factor, because to this date, in the last 30 years, it's kind of the local authorities, the local municipalities have been left with the whole responsibility. They should finance the social housing, the municipal housing. They run the programs independently, set their own rules and their own criteria. And as we know in this region, this fully independent approach has 2 main enemies. One is, I must say, is corruption at grassroots level, and the second one is the severe lack of funding. And that is very important, because let's talk about social housing in a municipality with 100,000 people. There are only 4 or 5 social housing units, 4 or 5 homes, and the number of requests is actually, you multiply it by 100 or even by 1,000 in case of large cities. So this sheer imbalance between offer and request makes the debate about public housing at local level almost redundant. Just picking on a question that was put in the chat from Besim, that unless you have what to offer, it's almost it's kind of redundant to speak about public housing. So yeah, this will be in a nutshell an overview of the housing situation in Romania. Thank you
very much. Also, thank you for already referring to Besim's question. I was gonna pull that into our discussion already, because actually I think he managed. I urge you all to look at the chat function and look at this question that was put there by our colleague Besim. I think it cuts through a lot of the issues that we were discussing, and maybe as a quick summary, I think we were more able to highlight a fair number of similarities between the region. I mean, there's obviously differences as to an extent of a certain problem, but it seemed to me, I was trying to take notes throughout this whole time, that issues faced have you have a number of shared dimensions. First of all, the very, very low share of public housing that would enable higher affordability of housing, and also the existing housing stock tends to be in bad quality, and is also, people are also suffering from overcrowdedness. So clearly there's a need for a better and bigger housing stock, where again the role of public housing could serve a goal in terms of renovating existing non-used buildings, or building some new apartments as well for people in need. So those are identified from all of you across the region. But then the question is, and then the other thing that popped up is either there's no national strategy, or it's a drawer strategy, or if there are some programs, they have largely failed to sort of serve the goal that they were ushered in for. So there is a big question mark as to, I think, who should be the agent of this change, because clearly there is a bigger need for publicly owned housing across the region in every single country. how do we facilitate that? Why have governments prioritized private ownership so much? And that has largely led us to this situation that we're facing now. How do you break out of this cycle? I know I'm asking a very big question, but maybe we can all, if you could all just contribute with one element that you think of a policy that could be implemented either in your country or across the region, or policies that have worked in other countries that I think you think could serve as an example, or anything that pops to mind in terms of sort of solving this issue that seems to be prevalent across the whole Central and Eastern European region. And maybe I hand over to Magda, who already started talking a bit about incentivizing sort of private investment and the programs that you mentioned. Maybe if you could speak a bit more about that, that would be great.
Thank you. Indeed, our government, within the framework of this mentioned the program mentioned before, tried to get interests from the private companies to get into the construction of the public stock, but unfortunately, it didn't really catch the attention of the developers. Maybe just the priority was given rather to develop just the rental market and which is at the level of 6% over the country. So maybe it's just the priority that took over, and some bigger investors coming also to Poland to invest, to buy entire buildings for renting, as the need for housing is so big that it seems that the first stage we will be seeing the offer from at the regular market for rent, which of course will result in overcrowding, in getting us an apartment as cheap as possible, so not big enough for the needs of the family, and also affordability issues that we see already to get with growing energy poverty in the indicators and economic impact of the energy prices as well. So we see that the situation and affordability for Polish families are the situation is just worsening instead of getting better. So unfortunately, from the program that aimed to somehow get incentive on the market to look to the other options or rental options, we see our government this year coming back to just subsidizing the ownership. Unfortunately, I think it's not a good direction.
But as you were speaking, some things also jumped to my mind that maybe in terms of investment into housing, in terms of private companies, often leads to financialization, or maybe foreign entities also buying housing. I don't know if there is any approaches to stopping or curbing the financialization of housing across the region that any of you would want to talk about. And maybe an intermediate solution is also social rental agencies, that I think is quite the hot topic also in a number of countries. Just quickly thinking that could also prove a solution in terms of including privately owned apartments that are maybe not used for social purposes. So if anyone wants to jump onto that or anything else, please feel free, just with the show of hands. I'm very aware that we're very short on time, so I think if anyone wants to add on to that, Zsolt, yeah, okay, and then Mincho, and I think you both have to be very quick. I apologize, because I think at 15 sharp, fortunately, we're kicked out of the session.
I just wanted to quickly mention about agreement in the society, because politicians' focuses are directed by the public focus, and as NGOs we have a big role of triggering the public discourse, and we need to somehow make the public's direct attention to the importance of housing. And they are the ones who can push politicians and act an electors, and this is important, because without this agreement, we cannot really run through these large interventions, which needs decades to be successful, which needs a lot of investments. And I think, we need something which flies through governmental periods and really keep consistent in time. And maybe on the investment part, there is a growing impact investment sector, and maybe we can also showcase and create some demonstration projects on a low level, but as a kind of laboratory, and we can offer the learnings from it to the decision makers later on.
I see some solutions pop up, so
I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. One of the problems with the social housing here is that we do not have a definition of what is a social home. I guess this is the case in other countries as well. Here, social home is equal to municipal home, and these are housing units where the poorest of the poor are accommodated, and these are usually socially deprived or vulnerable people. So we don't have a definition of a social home or social housing as it is understood in say Western European countries, and it affects the affordability, which is a huge issue here as well. So what needs to be done is develop a regulatory framework and grant access to non-corporate, to put it this way, players at this market, or come up with some type of incentives, financial, tax-related, subsidies-based, or whatever. And the second issue is I completely agree that the huge share of uninhabited housing units provides a great opportunity for solving the problems through instruments such as social rental agencies or similar to those. You should have in mind that the percentage of the uninhabited housing stock in the capital city of Sofia is 24%. But there are regions in the country with very high concentration of housing poverty, where the uninhabited housing stock is more than 50, 55, 60%. So it provides a good opportunity. Thank you.
Do you have another comment? Unless
yes,
Roberto
a very short comment that to finish with some positive note. We are also experimenting or discovering how big is the spaces area, and we recently published two researches in Habitat Poland and Habitat Great Britain about the size and some estimation how it could play a role for to increase the number of affordable housing for the most vulnerable. So just as my invitation to visit our websites and have a look on the on those discoverings, and maybe in the context of renovation wave, we could think about not only constructing new housing stock but also renovating existing one.
Very much for that, and absolutely agreed. I think there you can sort of twin two causes, increasing affordable housing for people, using the uninhabited stock, and also renovating them. So it will kind of, it's like, I don't know, it's like a bullet or like a perfect solution to social issues and climate issues at the same time. And I don't know, I wish we had more time to sort of go into this direction, because I know for Hungary that would be a great solution, and EU funds would be available for that, and maybe they are not being put to the best of use. So maybe at this Europe Housing Forum, this is also an issue that we should highlight, that there's large number of EU funds that could be made available to these goals, question is whether it's happening in each of our countries. So maybe that's not so positive of a note to end up on. Oh, I think we got some extra time. That's great. I see so I'm not going to do any wrap-up comments as of now. Instead, I maybe then we can move on to whether there's any questions from the audience apart from the great question that Basim asked, and we kind of went into answering. Or so I wait a few seconds in case anyone's diligently typing a comment, or if any of you have any other issues you want to raise or any other ideas that popped up through our discussion. But I give it some time to see, because I don't think anyone can type that fast. And it would be great to open the discussion to the audience as well. I see there's quite a few of you in case. But otherwise, I also think maybe the use of EU funds could be another interesting facet for us to discuss. If there's any good practices from across the region, that would also be great. I also like ending on a positive note. If recently there's been examples of, I don't know, from the upcoming multi-annual financial framework, or even the Resilience and Recovery Fund, or previous projects that were financed by EU funds, that would be great to hear about if anyone wants to jump in. Otherwise, we're also open to bad practices. I mean, maybe that's also important to highlight. And I don't see any questions in the chat, so if anyone wants to add something. Mincho.
With regard to the EU funding, I just something to share. We were working on the development of the operational program for regional development, and we managed to include building of social homes as an eligible activity to be funded by the program. So up to now, many municipalities included such projects in their investment plans, and building of such social housing stock gets funded by the operational program. I think it's a good example.
Does anyone else want to jump on? Could be another topic, whatever sprung to mind, because I think it's nice if we make use of the extra time we got. Any other comments? Oh, okay, now I see a question. Basim with another question, on fire today. Issue of terminology. Social housing is understood as housing for the very poor, as Mincho says. How do we differentiate the housing provision of lower middle class and low income segments of the population that have access and affordability issues, especially in larger cities? Well, if any of you can reflect on that in the next 2 minutes, again, excellent question. Wouldn't say necessarily easy to answer. So yeah, social housing can be used for the lowest income groups, but it's becoming more of a
we have to differentiate social housing, affordable housing, and that's what we already referred. It's two different cases. And as Magda also mentioned, we can use the private sector also to support the affordable housing, which maybe the definition of affordable is lower than the market price, and it really depends on or should depend on the income of the family who is living in one of the affordable housing, how the rent is compared to the market price, but definitely lower. It could be 80%, it could be 50%, and definitely these are higher than the average social rental prices. So one example is what happens in Poland and also in Hungary, the social rental agencies, which offers even private owners a package which makes them, moving into a lower rent because the security of their property and also their income is assured by the agency. And if we talk about affordable rental, we need to include not just the social rental agencies, but the social housing cooperatives and also other non-profit versions of building or renovating houses and offering it to the public. It's really important that it needs a strong mission. They need to be non-profit, and over the time it should be prevented to sell it, so privatize it, and that could be a kind of explanation and also some solutions in that regard.
That's great. That's actually a very nice final comment to end up on, that maybe we have some hope in these sort of forms of cooperative housing and non-profit housing that are also growing across the region. Maybe it's like a slow but steady growth, but I think that's already hinting at more progressive solutions also in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think we have 10 seconds whereby I have to wrap up, and thank you all of you for your contribution, and thanks for those listening in, and have a lovely